But there is no such place as Buffalo Springs. So when we heard that they were proposing to do some activities in Buffalo Springs, I think a lot of people thought, well, I don't know where Buffalo Springs is. I guess it's not going to affect me.
Wow.
And it wasn't until October, several months later, when they came out with their draft scoping notice, or whatever it was called, the Buffalo Springs scoping letter, where it turns out that they're completely ignoring all these recreational opportunities, all this historical and cultural significance, all the water features, and all the biodiversity. And what they're proposing for this area is to log it extensively, as you described. So that's when we became concerned about what is this place called Buffalo Springs, and we realized what they were doing. And of course, it's sort of a little paradox that the Forest Service, in coming up with this made-up name, chose the initial, the words Buffalo Springs, whose initials are BS. Because unfortunately, that is exactly what their proposal is a BS proposal when they tag this word restoration onto all this logging. And when you mentioned the roads, one thing that we have right here where we live, of course, is we live right next to what's called the Youngs Creek Horse Trail. And it's a 13-mile trail loop, and they want to convert 9 miles of a 13-mile trail into logging roads. And these logging roads then would lead from clear cut to clear cut to timber sale to timber sale. And who wants to hike or mountain bike or horse ride on a logging road that goes from clear cut to clear cut? I mean, they're proposing to absolutely destroy and degrade the recreational qualities that make this such a lovely place to visit in the first place. And for what? Because there's money to be made, but that money is going to be made one time. I mean, I can take you to places in the forest when they were clear cutting back in the 70s and 80s, and they still look like clear cuts 40 years later. This degradation they're proposing to do, while it might yield a quick burst of financial benefit, that financial benefit will be realized only on a very short-term basis, and then the degradation lasts for a long, long time. What's interesting is this is basically a continuation of what they were doing back in the 70s and 80s when we got involved in the first place. And now what we find is that the people who work for the Forest Service now, in the time since I got involved the first time around, and now there's been 100% turnover. There's not a single person still working for the Forest Service who remembers what we went through 30 years ago. They're all dead or retired. And another thing that's significant there is all the things that they claimed that they were, all the benefits they claimed they were going to get from what they were doing back then. They never manifested. They claimed they were going to bring back oak and hickory. Didn't happen. They claimed they were going to do this. They claimed they were going to do that. No, what they did is they heavily degraded the forest. They got the money, and then they all retired. Now, I'm not saying they personally benefited. There's a different kind of corruption here. And the corruption is that the money from cutting these trees is retained by the Forest Service. So when the Forest Service at one time in the last century was considered the most respected and most admired federal agency, and at that time what they were doing was they were preventing timber theft. It was called custodial management. They were putting out fires, and they were planting pine trees on areas that were subject to heavy erosion and thin soils and areas where the topsoil was all washing away. Well, now here we are 50, 60, 70 years later, and what's the Forest Service proposing to do? Well, exactly the opposite. Now they want to burn the forest repeatedly. They want to clear cut these pines on these heavily eroded and highly erodible sites, and then they want to cut down the trees and keep the money. You know, you cut down somebody's trees and you keep the money. I think that's called timber theft. Now, I'm not actually accusing them of timber theft, but I am saying that it is highly suspect that the Forest Service is proposing to do all this activity in the forest that involves cutting trees, and nowhere in any of their documents does it mention timber sales or the amount of money that's going to be generated or what's going to happen to that money.
That's one of the 8 points that we want to talk to you about, because that's right. You do say in that entire document, there's no mention of the timber sales or other financial considerations, and yet they're proposing to remove thousands of commercially valuable oaks and other trees.
Thousands of highly valuable oaks. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I was surprised to see that more than half of the entire operating budget of the Indiana Division of Forestry comes from cutting and selling trees in the state forest. So
absolutely.
Do you think that they are standing to profit from this proposal?
Oh, there's no question whatsoever with either the State Division of Forestry on the state forest or the Forest Service on the Hoosier National Forest and every other national forest in the country. sadly, and I could go into some detail about this if you'd like, but what happened is back in the 70s and 80s when we were talking about, and even earlier, is that the Congress at that time was dominated, at least the committees that oversaw the Forest Service budget was dominated by people from districts that had major industries dependent on cutting and processing trees in their districts. So what they did is they were trying to get as much timber coming off the public lands, this is out west, mind you, into those mills to maintain those jobs and to get those campaign contributions back into their coffers so they could continue to get reelected and to continue to serve the corporations that were significant economic factors in their congressional districts. Well, what those policies did was they applied to every national forest in the country, including the small Hoosier, Daniel Boone in Kentucky, Wayne in Ohio, Shawnee in Illinois, and so forth. So what they did is there were provisions in there that allowed the counties to keep some of the money from the timber sales. They're trying to buy off those constituencies that might have reason to oppose this activity of degrading the lands that could be the basis for a tourism and recreation economy as opposed to a timber economy. Well, what they also did, these congressional committees, is that they got buy-in from the Forest Service by establishing first one and then another to where there's now 6 different funds that the Congress has given the Forest Service that allows the Forest Service to retain on virtually unlimited percentage of the receipts from selling trees off the public lands. So the Forest Service initially was just given a small cut, but now over time, the Forest Service has learned how to use this discretion and these incentives to benefit themselves. There's 6 different funds that the Forest Service can use to keep receipts from timber sales on the national forest to use to augment the Forest Service's budget, which means budgetary flexibility that does not require a congressional appropriation. So most of the money that comes from Congress is for specific things. And a lot of those things, unfortunately, are for cutting trees and building roads. But what the money from the cutting of trees does is it gives the Forest Service the discretion to use those funds for other things. So this is another one of these paradoxes. The Congress tells the Forest Service, you got to do all these things with the national forest, but they only give the money for cutting trees and building roads. So the Forest Service, in a fairly crafty fashion, retains the receipts from cutting the trees and now fire. We'll get back to fire in a minute. But they can use that money then to do the many other things that they're required by Congress to do. So it's twisted, it's perverse, it's tragic.
It is.
And unfortunately, it's been going on for a long time that the Forest Service now benefits from cutting the trees that we're paying them to protect.
Well, how do they plan to use these funds and how much acreage are they proposing to burn?
Well, now, we don't know. See, this is somewhat opaque. The Forest Service's budget is very, very confusing document. And there's footnote after footnote, and it refers to different sections of the document. I mean, to try and figure out what all these numbers mean is definitely beyond my skill set right now. Obviously, I'm doing my best to learn, but they're not even supplying us the information, the raw data to be able to make the assessment of what's actually happening. So we don't know what they're using the money for. We do know that some of the funds, like this restoration fund, the money retained in the restoration fund can only be used to prepare additional timber sales. So that's what part of the money is for. The Forest Service is actually hiring foresters now. And, you think about that term, a forester. It sounds like a worthy and noble profession to be somebody who stewards and protects the forest. But tragically, once again, as with the term restoration, this term forester refers to somebody whose specialty is cutting down forests, not growing forests.
It mystifies me that you could be in the forest every day and be able to implement any of these plans. It's just unbelievable.
My dear, I could not agree with you more. It is so disturbing to think that so many of these people went to college thinking that they were learning how to do something worthy, noble, and a net public benefit. And once they get there, they realize, no, I'm sorry. You've been deceived. You are here to learn how to convert public assets into private wealth for those who know how to use the system to benefit financially from converting public wealth into private profit. That's what it's all about.